All right, hello economics students. So this is probably our last video on answering SAT questions for Unit 3, Outcome 3, which is the global economy. And we're looking at trade liberalisation, so how we can answer a trade liberalisation question. Just remember, liberalisation is a bit of a mouthful. It just means to open up to free trade. It's the opposite of protecting trade. And the dot point says the effect of trade lib on, so trade lib becomes the cause, opening up trade becomes the cause, and we're going to think about how it affects our international competitiveness and, you guessed it, our 3 goals and living standards. Now, I'm going to say to you that you should always think about how trade lib impacts our international competitiveness, even if you don't get asked about it. So even if the question doesn't specifically say how does it impact competitiveness of Australian businesses, you should still think that way. But what are the types of questions you might get? Well, how does trade lib impact our macroeconomic goals? How does trade lib impact our living standards? How does trade lib impact international competitiveness? Or some sort of combination of those. So what's the structure? How are we going to answer these questions? The first thing to note is it's probably 4 marks because there's a little bit more to do with this area of study or this dot point. So I've got this question here. Explain how trade lib would impact international competitiveness and one of our goals, or living standards. In fact, in this video, I'm going to do living standards because I did goals in the other videos. So X just becomes one of our goals or living standards. So keep in mind, it's still a cause and effect question. So it's still trying to link trade lib to a goal. I would say regardless of, I think I already just said this, but regardless of whether you do, whether you get asked about it, you always go through international competitiveness. Most importantly, when you get a question about trade liberalisation, you should always think about the short-term and the long-term impacts. Okay, so they're going to be different. So I would say as long as the question's over or it's worth more than 2 marks, you should do both, just to be sure. But definitely if it's 4 marks, the examiner's looking for a short-term and a long-term impact. So let's get into a question. Explain how trade lib would impact the international competitiveness. And like I said, I'm going to do living standards in this video, but that could be a goal. So it's a 4-mark question. Where are the marks? Well, trade lib is our cause here, so we need to demonstrate an understanding of what it is. Just like if this was to explain how a movement in the exchange rate impacted something else, we would start out by saying, what does a movement in the exchange rate actually mean? So we're going to start with that. Then you're going to explain how it impacts international competitiveness. That makes sense because that just is the next link along. How does this trade lib impact international competitiveness? The second 2, or the last 2 marks, are about living standards. And like I said, there are 2 different impacts. There's going to be a short-term impact and a long-term impact. So you need to say how it would affect our living standards in the short term, and then for the final mark, how it would affect our living standards in the longer term. So let's get into it. Here's an answer I wrote. As always, it's right, but it's not good enough. So I started out, by saying that trade lib is a movement towards free trade. It's a good start. That it will increase international competitiveness, very true, and deteriorate living standards in the short term, yes, we know that, and improve them in the longer term. So the very bare bones of an answer here, but it doesn't really demonstrate a lot of deep understanding of what these concepts are. But it's right, so it's a good structure to start with. Again, it's probably a 1 or 2. Let's get to a 3 or 4. Whoops. I'm working on my transitions. So, trade liberalisation is a movement towards free trade. Well, that's 1 mark there to demonstrate the understanding of trade lib. So you want to do more than just say it's a movement towards free trade. So what can we do? Well, we're going to specifically say it involves the removal of subsidies, tariffs or quotas, and the signing of free trade agreements. Now, I reckon if you got 2 or 3 of those, you're fine. So we're demonstrating a deeper understanding. It's still not perfect. We could do more, but it's demonstrating an understanding of what it actually means. So then we said it increases international competitiveness. Well, why? So competition from overseas, this is the key part of trade liberalisation. We open up to overseas competition, and that drives efficiency gains for Australian businesses. So they have to improve. Cool, that improves it. It hurts material living standards in the short term. Well, why? Well, some businesses will actually go out of business. They won't be able to compete with overseas firms. So we're going to say that. Rather than just saying it'll hurt material living standards in the short term, why does it do that? And it's sort of flowing on from the second mark. Finally, in the long term, it will improve living standards. But why? Well, if we can improve our international competitiveness, we can then increase export sales and we can grow our economy. And that means in the longer term, there's more jobs for Australians. So short term bad, long term good. All right, so this is getting towards a 3, maybe, yeah, I would say a 3 out of 4, but we can still do much more than this. This is not going to stand out for the examiner or your teacher. So what can we do? Have a think about what we can add to this answer. It's going to get a bit chockers on this slide here, but let's try. Okay, well, we could definitely say what subsidies and tariffs are. So I use a lot of brackets, or I just put the definitions in brackets, like a mini definition. So subsidies, well, they're payments to Australian businesses. Tariffs, they're taxes on importing firms or taxes on imports. And we sign free trade agreements. Well, they're agreements to trade without barriers. Again, it's not much more, but it's building a much more impressive answer. The next mark was about international competitiveness. Well, students always forget to actually state what international competitiveness is. So again, I've got it here, the ability of Australian firms to compete in global markets on price or quality. So straight away, you're ahead of the pack. And I've improved my argument here. I've said as competition from overseas businesses forces Australian businesses to specialise. And that's a really key term there, to specialise. Specialisation is one of the benefits of trade. In areas they have a comparative advantage. So if you can get specialisation, comparative advantage, I didn't use economies of scale here, but you could have taken that route as well. You could have talked about how free trade leads to economies of scale and we can spread our fixed costs. Some sort of deeper argument here is really going to impress and make your answer stand out. And it drives an improvement of which type of efficiency? Well, most likely productive efficiency, at least first. And then I've gone on to say, well, this is due to an improvement in productivity and a reduction in waste, or wastage, I could say. I don't know why I've got a brackets there, sorry. Okay, so I've really got a stronger answer already. I've stepped out what trade lib means and what each of the types of parts of trade liberalisation actually are referring to, subsidies and tariffs, and I made a much stronger argument about how it actually works. So now I need to bring it together with the material living standards. So in the short term, and we already said that some businesses will struggle to compete and they're going to shut down. But why does that hurt living standards? Why does that hurt living standards? Well, there's a slowdown in economic activity. If you really wanted to impress, you'd say that structural unemployment would increase. Think about the Australian car industry. And that would decrease access to goods and services. So we're explicitly stating what living standards or material living standards are. Which leads to the final mark, which is we're just going to do exactly the same. We're just going to give more detail here. So it'll improve living standards in the long term because efficiency gains will shift aggregate supply. We could say it increases the capacity of the economy, but mainly it puts downward pressure on the cost of production in Australia. So if we can become more efficient due to competition, due to us specialising, then that would put downward pressure on costs in Australia. And that means we're more internationally competitive. That will drive jobs. And again, at the end, I've just explicitly stated that will increase access to goods and services. So there's a lot going on there. Whoops, I'm still working on my transitions, as you can see. There's the answer if you want to pause it and have a good look at it. But really, hopefully that helped you to sort of flesh out the bare bones that we started with and think about how you can get your answer from a 2 to a 3 to a 4. All right. Bye for now. Well, that went for ages.